Thank you, John. Thank you for that great perspective. For the next few moments, we're going to be talking about the future of the conservative movement, and we're joined on this podium for this discussion by Dr. Paul Kengor, well known to many of you as a professor of political science at Grove City College. He's also the author of over a dozen books. How many of you have read at least one of Paul's books?
This will be interesting to see.
How many? These are your fans, Paul.
Yeah.
How many of you brought a copy of one of Paul's books to have it autographed? These are your brightest fans, Paul.
Right.
And how many of you are now going to go out and buy one of Paul's books after this breakfast? I want to see those hands. Those are your prospects, Paul. He's a longtime columnist and senior editor of the American Spectator, a frequent public speaker. Some of his books on Reagan have earned him opportunities to go to the Ronald Reagan Library, the Ranch Center, the Heritage Foundation speaking on Reagan, Princeton University's amazing James Madison program, and so on and so forth. Paul received his doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, his master's degree from the American University School of International Service, and an honorary doctorate from Franciscan University. He is one of the most thoughtful and solid observers of the political scene in Pennsylvania within the context of political history. I'd like to invite Paul to say a few words of introduction in response to what John gave us, and then we're going to begin with a series of questions that I will phrase concerning the future of the conservative movement, and then there will be an opportunity for questions that you will phrase. So think about your questions as you hear them, both Paul and John speak. But Paul, give us your perspective at this point where, as John said, there's a sense that something is in the air. I think there is a sense that we are at a kind of a cultural and political pivot point. How do you see it, and where do you think it's pointed and headed?
Well, thank you, Colin. And as I was walking down the corridor here, I thought of what Ronald Reagan said to Nancy Reagan in 1976 when Gerald Ford said, "Ron, come on up and share a few thoughts." And he said, "I haven't the foggiest idea what I'm going to say." But I got some ideas here from John's talk in particular. And as I was sitting backstage, I talked to Dave, the tech guy. I said, "Give me a piece of paper, would you? You got a piece of paper?" So he ripped out of his own notebook this little piece of paper. And I wrote down a few thoughts inspired by John's words. He talked about strong leaders, of course, conservatism, and he finished with Ronald Reagan. And Reagan is my specialty, probably beyond any other figure that I've studied. And I recently taught a course at Grove City College on conservatism, and I had about 2 weeks left in the course. And we went through a whole bunch of different readings: M. Stanton Evans, Russell Kirk, Frank Meyer, William F. Buckley Jr., Al Regnery, you name them. And I had the last reading on the list was one of my own books. It was called 11 Principles of a Reagan Conservative. And looking at it, I only had 2 weeks left. I thought, which of these 11 principles can I cover, right? How many can you cover in that time? And I covered 6 of them. And it's interesting that John pretty much hit on all 6 of those in the talk, which shows how we think alike. And I won't spend too much time on these, but the ones that I focused on and that I thought you referenced were, and so looking forward to conservatives, I would say these are kind of bullet points for you. So get out your little piece of paper, start writing, all right, okay? But one is limited government, which John made reference to. And every conservative must believe in limited government. And over the next 4 years, that's going to be something you're going to be pointing to a lot, right? Limited government. As conservatives, we don't believe in no government, but we believe in limited government. As Ronald Reagan put it, we oppose nanny state, womb to tomb, cradle to grave, creeping socialism government. So you don't want to keep piling programs upon programs. We support lower taxes, and Reagan did that, cut the upper income tax rate from 70% all the way down to 28%. A third principle that Reagan believed in was sanctity and dignity of human life. And I was glad that you mentioned Dan Lipinski. He's one of a dying breed, and that's the pro-life Democrat. We had one as governor of Pennsylvania, Casey, a few years ago, and I must say that his son, our senator, who's supposed to be a pro-life Democrat, has an abysmal pro-life voting record on the issue. He has not been good at that at all. The other of the six, so are you counting right? Limited government, lower taxes, sanctity and dignity of human life, faith, all right, that's key. And that's becoming increasingly clear with the drift in secularism with the Democratic Party and the progressive left. And what faith needs, this would be the fifth, freedom, right? And freedom needs faith. And our old friend M. Stanton Evans' book, the theme is freedom. And if you have freedom alone, you can have anarchy, right? I mean, freedom needs faith. Faith helps navigate freedom, right? If freedom alone can be not Augustine's City of God, but the Las Vegas Strip. Faith provides a moral rudder, a kind of navigation to guide freedom. Ronald Reagan talked of the twin beacons of faith and freedom that brighten the American sky. So think about that, the twin beacons of faith and freedom that brighten the American sky. So if you start dimming one of those beacons, namely faith, which is what we're doing, and you just have freedom, it's going to be dim, it's going to be darker, it's going to be harder to navigate around. And that gets to the sixth point, and that would be American exceptionalism. Ronald Reagan really saw America as a shining city upon a hill. And we in America today, and especially with the progressive left, we're not teaching that. Ronald Reagan said in his farewell address, which was written by Peggy Noonan, he delivered this on January 11th, 1989, and he said that we need to teach freedom, we need to teach that America is a special place, we need to teach that America is an exceptional place, and he told all the young people, he said, if your parents aren't teaching you what it means to be an American, nail them on it, call them on it. Right? That's something that we need to be teaching. And Reagan had a phrase, and I'll close with this, and then we can dialogue. This is a favorite quote of mine. He said, America is less of a place than an idea. America is less of a place than an idea. And he said that in a speech at tiny little William Woods College in Fulton, Missouri in 1952. He was 41 years old. He and Nancy just got married. They took the train from California all the way to Missouri. And he had a graduating class of about 400 women, all women's college. And so it was one of the first speeches that he gave before he became a Republican, before he was just at that point really becoming a conservative. He had been an FDR Democrat, called himself a hemophiliac liberal, right? A bleeding heart liberal. And that phrase, America is less of a place than an idea, you think about it. I mean, that's why people come to this country. You know, they don't come here so much for the place, for the territory, for the geography, right? For the beauty. I mean, there are lots of beautiful places all over Europe, all over the world. John and I, even though John has the cool Italian last name and I don't, I'm half Italian. My mother was 100% Italian. And you know, I've been to Italy. It's a gorgeous place. So is Germany. So is Spain. So are all these different countries. So is Ireland. But people left those places to come to America for the idea of America because of what America offered. We had a speaker at one of our Institute for Faith and Freedom luncheons on Tuesday, and his name was Peter Keim. He's with the National Flag Foundation. And I'll wrap up with this. He quoted Franklin Knight Lane, who was an early progressive. He was a Secretary of the Interior for Woodrow Wilson, of all people. But he's got a famous quote about the American flag. It was almost like a vision that he had about the American flag speaking to him. And the quote was this. So the flag was saying to him, I am whatever you make me, nothing more. I am your belief in yourself, your dream of what a people may become. I am no more than what you believe me to be, and I am all that you believe that I can be. I am what you make me and nothing more. And when you think of people last time this summer taking that flag and torching it in the streets, right? We believe the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference not in burning the flag, but holding the flag up, venerating the flag. And what Peter Keim there, what Franklin Knight Lane said about the flag, that's true of America too. I am what you make of me and nothing more. And in this day of critical race theory and the 1619 Project, can you imagine saying that America began in 1619 with the first slave ships? Right? It began in 1776. Actually, Ronald Reagan said it really began in 1620 with John Winthrop and the Pilgrims, right, 1630, when they first used that phrase, shining city upon a hill. And so what is America? It's what you make of me and nothing more. So our job is to really teach that, what it really means to be an American and what it really means to be a conservative. And I would say now these next 4 years, what's the best use of these 4 years for conservatives? Shine the light on the Biden administration, the progressives, the liberals. Look at how they're against lower taxes, against energy independence, against pipelines, against fracking, against limited government, against the sanctity and dignity of human life, against American exceptionalism, right? Attack faith, attack freedom, and remind people of what it really means to be a conservative. So do what Ronald Reagan would do these next 4 years. Use this time to teach conservatism.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Paul. Great. The ideas that Paul just discussed, the principles, are timeless ideas. They are basically, we believe, truths. But they exist within an environment which changes over time. The American political and philosophical environment shifts, goes up and down, left and right, and so on. I've often felt that one of the most useful diagnostic questions for where the American body politic is the question, should government do more or should government do less? That was a question that Reagan himself asked. During his time, there was no question that the predominant view was that government should do less. He said in his inaugural speech that government is the problem, not the solution to the problem. In the years since, that has changed. It appears to me right now that we might be in a period where more people are saying government should do more, perhaps because of the experience with the pandemic and other things. Grover Norquist, who is a regular at this conference for many years, has always maintained that America is a center-right country. That, I think, assumes that the predominant view on government's role is that perhaps government should do less. Are we now in a period where people are saying government should do more? And if so, how does it portend for the conservative movement as a whole? Both of you.
Well, I'll say this. I watch this data very carefully. Gallup puts out a poll every year, the number of people who call themselves conservative versus the number who call themselves liberal. And conservative, it's usually around 40–45%. And liberal, it's usually in the low 20s. Now, that's closed a little bit in the last few years. And conservative is a little under 40, and liberal is like mid-20s, upper 20s, and that concerns me. And I'm especially concerned by the number of young people who are saying that they prefer socialism over capitalism.
Right.
Or in a recent poll, a fourth to almost a third saying that they believe private property should be abolished. All right, so they're even saying favorable things about communism. And I got a kind of a vitriolic email a couple weeks ago from a guy. He sent me 5 of them. And I told him, I said, you'll notice I answer the one that doesn't use the F word, right? And I find sometimes that when you reach out to people in kindness and charity and try to dialogue with them, they often do. And he did, and we ended up having a very good conversation. He used to be a conservative. He said he left in around 2008. He now considers himself a democratic socialist. And among the things that he was pushing was for free college education. And I just sort of walked through that with him. And I said, why do you want people to have a free college? And it kind of pushed back, right? And say, let's go back to the foundation. What's wrong with the idea of someone who wants to go to college paying for their own education? Getting a loan for it, saving money for it, right? Learning the kind of life skills that involve saving and being responsible, paying money back. Why must government do that? And once he really started to think about it, right? I think realizing too that he even did that, right? That maybe that isn't something the government has to do. But that, I think he had bought into the whole Bernie, AOC, free tuition, everything else. And a lot of times with young people today, they're so overwhelmed with all the junk on social media and everything else that they learn that they need older folks who've been around a little longer to stop and say, wait a second, I paid for my college education. And yeah, my master's degree was way too much money. I'll tell you, it killed me. My wife and I for 10 years were broke, all right? But what's wrong with making people do that?
You're describing an investment, Paul.
An investment. Right. And I even told him, I said, a lot of people shouldn't go to college. There's a lot of people who should go to trade school, should go to the military, should start their own business. And so even he was kind of hooked into the idea that everybody has to go to college, which is really antiquated, frankly. I mean, more people thought of that 30 years ago than they do now. So again, this is a good moment to try to go back to those first principles and ideas and teach.
John?
Obviously, whenever you give someone a government program, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to take it away. And this has been a basis that primarily under Democratic presidents, the bureaucracy is built, big government has grown, and hence you see a diminishing in the idea of smaller government. And let me give you an example, and I'm sure Paul will remember this. In the 1980 Republican platform, the party manifesto in the year Ronald Reagan was first elected, it called for, among other things, abolishing the Department of Education, Energy,
Commerce.
Commerce, and Housing and Urban Development, not to mention other agencies such as the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2000, when George W. Bush was nominated, there was no talk at all in the party platform of abolishing anything. It was taken out. And I remember many delegates were upset with it. And I remember I asked the chairman of the platform committee, Governor Thompson of Wisconsin, who later became Secretary of Health and Human Services, do you believe in abolishing any government agency or rolling back any government body? And he said, I believe in winning. And that's an exact quote that I remember after 20 years.
Wow.
So I would have to say we are also seeing, even under the last Republican president, a marriage with the government programs that were created by Democrats. And this is going to be something that will be debated at future PLCs and CPAC in Washington. Small government conservatism versus acceptance of big government and using it for one's own ends on the right. It'll be a fascinating debate to watch.
And Ronald Reagan did not succeed in abolishing any of those agencies or departments, which kind of Bush put up maybe the flag of surrender. And even that didn't have the will to do it.
Paul, you mentioned the Gallup survey, and the distinction was between people who self-identify as conservative versus liberal. The liberals have rebranded themselves as progressives. So I'm not sure that the Gallup question necessarily means the same thing to the audience that it did then. There has been some talk in conservative circles that conservatism maybe needs to consider some form of rebranding. What do each of you think of that idea? What have you heard? and where do you think it might be headed?
Well, I would just say that ideas and principles such as those that Paul laid out stay the same over the years, although we are going to have a debate, I'm sure, on big government versus small government conservatism. But essentially, principles stay the same. On the other hand, there's also a need, probably, for new voices and new faces to articulate tried and true beliefs. I mentioned Barry Goldwater earlier. Many of the things he said energized young conservatives in the 60s, and yet when they were run through the filter of the national media even then, they sounded like the rantings of someone after a few scotches at the officers' club of the Fort Myer base. Ronald Reagan said exactly the same things that Goldwater did, including addressing issues such as Social Security and Medicare. And he was elected president eventually. The idea is that maybe tried and true conservatism doesn't need a refurbishing or an overhaul. It just needs a new face on it. Final point, I mentioned earlier that there were hundreds of thousands of Ray Donovans, many of them here in Pennsylvania, who felt the Democratic Party left them. I've met many of them at PLCs. Some of them have accents, and some are men and women of color. The opportunity is there with the right spokesman and the best articulation of conservatism.
That's right, and Russell Kirk said that conservatism is about an enduring moral order. And so, we believe in a set of core absolutes, and that defines not just where we stand on economics and taxes, but it should also define where we stand on social and cultural issues. And Ronald Reagan gave a speech to CPAC in 1977 where he said conservatives need to be whole and entire conservatives, embrace both the social as well as the economic issues. And people told him not to do that. Jim Baker throughout the 1980s would advise him, Dick Darman and others, don't talk about abortion. Don't do it. You're gonna get killed if you talk about that. Don't talk about that. And Reagan said, well, to me, there's nothing more important than the fundamental dignity of all human life, and I'm going to talk about it. And he said there's nothing wrong with being a single issue voter on that issue if you believe that that's the most important, the first and most fundamental of all freedoms. So he goes with that plan, and in 1980, against an incumbent, anyone know how many states Reagan won in 1980? 44 out of 50. Won the Electoral College 489 to 49. 51 to 41%. Beat Carter by 10 percentage points. And then from 80 to 84, talked about all that stuff that people told him not to talk about, and was reelected by winning 49 out of 50 states. The Electoral College count, I love this data point. The Electoral College count in 1984 was 525 to 13. Okay? So Reagan did that by embracing all the issues that conservatives ought to embrace, and we shouldn't be afraid to do it either.
The moral order of which you spoke, when you cited Russell Kirk, implies some recognition of God, some kind of theology.
That's right.
The very concept of theology, belief in God, is under assault such as we've never seen it before. The secularization of America, the pulling of all references of God out of the founding in the way that children are being taught in school, changes that environment so that it is less logically connected and responsive to the concept of a moral order. Address that from a standpoint of the educational establishment for a moment.
Yeah, and that's where you get into the mess where we are today. I mean, if you Dostoevsky said, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. You can come up with your own definitions of everything. To quote Anthony Kennedy and his horrific KCV Planned Parenthood decision, right? in 1992, which preserved Roe v. Wade. He said the meaning of freedom in America is coming up with your own meaning of meaning, your own definition of freedom, right? Your own idea of liberty, your own conceptions of the universe, of life, everything. That's not the founders' conception of freedom. It's not a faith-based conception of freedom. And it's what's allowing the secular progressive party to redefine quite literally everything, from whether a child in a womb is a child, to marriage, family, even your gender. Facebook now lists over 70 gender options that you can choose from. So, and that's where the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is. And you're seeing it with Joe Biden right now. They're pulling him in all those different directions. But again, the twin beacons of faith and freedom that Reagan talked about. Move the beacon of faith, and freedom becomes suddenly chaos. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of America today.
I really can't add to that, except we are seeing a creeping assault on God and faith in history as well as in society in general. A few years ago, I talked to a former congressman from Atlanta who had gone to high school in that area and had listened on the radio when Franklin Roosevelt made the speech before Congress on December 8th, 1941, asking for a declaration of war and calling for victory. And in the end of the speech, it said, FDR said, with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. Right. And recently a memorial was put up in Atlanta to that speech. And it has all of the key phrases, the date of infamy, but taken out is so help us God.
Amazing.
And this is just one microcosm that is so emblematic of the culture. Where it starts, who took the ball and ran with it, I have no idea at this point.
And by the way, that's not just neutrality toward religion, that's hostility toward religion. And it reminds me of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Bladenberg Cross case. And the judge before that, before it went to the Supreme Court, the cross in Maryland built by mothers of World War I survivors. And the judge said of the cross, well, why don't you just cut the arms off of it? It's like, cut the arms off of it. So it's like a straight pillar with the arms sawed off the side of it, right? And then it'll be acceptable? That's just madness.
Not only is there a hostility to religion that you both mentioned, but there is a media hostility, which is of a different character. We've always known that the media is biased toward the left. But I've never seen headlines get to the matter of motive, particularly with regard to the Republican Party, that I've seen lately, particularly on the matter of voting integrity. Words like restriction and limitation and all of those things that are not part of voter integrity at all. They're about having an accurate count of the body politic. But motives have crept into our headlines in the media and on other media. Even while we've had a rise of conservative media, the hostility of the so-called established media exceeds anything that I've seen. Do you find the same thing, and how do you think it affects the conservative movement as well as the Republican Party? Because the media wants to identify the two as one and the same.
It's terrible. Even Major League Baseball has politicized it.
Right.
The idea that the commissioner of Major League Baseball would yank the All-Star game out of Atlanta because he buys the ideological framing of what happened in Atlanta by Joe Biden, who called it Jim Crow 2.0, and Stacey Abrams is insane. And just to give you a quick example of this, last night before I went to bed, I hate sleeping in hotels by myself. I never sleep well. So on my phone, I went to Google, and I typed in Gregorian chant, which is what I play at night, which usually runs for like 2 hours and puts me to sleep. And I open up Gregorian chant, and there's an ad from Stacey Abrams. And she's yapping about racist election integrity laws are taking on, and I'm like, oh Lord, I've just put a Gregorian chant, I got Stacey Abrams here. And I just sat there for a minute and lay there in the bed, okay, help me. And then I finally hit skip ad, and I thought, I don't even have CNN on. I don't even have MSNBC. I just opened Google, and I got to get assaulted with this craziness. So it's just really, it's polluting everything. And imagine the 18, 19-year-old who doesn't know a lot of this stuff, opens up his or her phone and gets smacked with this garbage all the time and doesn't even know what to believe. And then the president says, well, it's Jim Crow 2.0, right? It's like,
John,
what's he talking?
John, you live in the world of media. What have you seen in the last several years in terms of this growing hostility? Not simply bias, but active hostility.
I think probably I could quote from Isaiah about this. Come now, let us reason together, yet if ye refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken. Welcome to the attitude of the left media towards anyone who may disagree from their worldview. It's become a lot more hostile. That's inarguable. And people are taking themselves a lot more seriously now. Now, why this comes about, I don't quite understand, except perhaps I could blame it on some universities that are out
Please.
there. Not Grove City.
Not Grove City.
And not Hillsdale, which just accepted my papers as a journalist.
But the other 99%, yes.
Exactly.
And it's literally 99%.
And there's another factor, too. Paul mentioned that about the laws for election reform in Georgia. The business community helps push a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the culture changing. Why did Coca-Cola come out with a denunciation of that measure? Well, I've seen one analysis that said they're afraid of having so many young employees who feel strongly about this that they would leave if Coca-Cola did not say anything. So I would say simply, it's the culture, stupid, and it's the contemporaneous attitude that it's cool to be for and against certain things.
Yeah, woke corporate culture is killing us. It really
So in the
is.
3.5 minutes we have left, let's point in a positive direction. What are the encouraging signs that you see that can bring conservatism back above 40% in that Gallup poll, but more to the point, can address the cultural drift towards big government and return to the principles that you articulated in your course and among the founders?
Boy, I don't know. I don't have any hope at all, to tell you the truth. That's not how
John?
I'm supposed to end. Well, no, so Ronald Reagan used to say that Reagan had faith in the common sense of the American people, and I mean I don't know, that was 30 or 40 years ago, but I do think that people intuitively, and I've seen this when you walk people through these issues, like the guy that I mentioned, the emailer. And you just kind of in a common sense way ask certain questions, like what do you mean by that? But think about this, right? Do you really think free college education is a good? Start to unpack it, right? People who say that they support socialism, people who say they support the abolition of private property, right? So wait a second. I'm not going to yell at you. You get angry. Think about that. You're answering that in a poll question on your cell phone while you're at Starbucks drinking a grande skim latte. All right. Point 3 of the Communist Manifesto called for abolition of all right of inheritance. You really think it'd be right that you can't inherit any of your parents' money and the government takes one? So if you really kind of walk them through this stuff, sometimes it gets through. But we're fighting against the universities. Of course, once they get into their 20s and they start paying taxes and owning homes and so forth, experience starts to teach them on these things. But I guess we need to be patient and just try to educate.
And hold firm to the principles.
Yeah, that's right.
John? We have 1:13 left.
Just underscoring my remarks earlier, having a fresh spokesman and fresh faces in the body politic is going to be very advantageous to a conservative movement. There's no question about it. Having a free discussion on controversial issues without fear of being driven out of a cause or expelled is very important. I never felt stronger about that than when I got messages from friends of mine who've now become never Trumpers and said, these people have to be driven out of the party. And finally, staying firm to principle in spite of the odds, in spite of the invective, and never forgetting the words of Whittaker Chambers, that we do things not because they're probable, but because they're right.
And I would add, be not afraid.
Be not afraid. Thank you both for a valuable perspective. I'm going to turn the podium over to one of the true bright lights of the media that have not departed from the principles you spoke to. Jeff Lord, formerly of CNN, and a great friend of the PLC.
Good.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Paul.
Okay.